Good evening, everybody. We are here again to talk about 1940, events of 80 years ago in Dunkirk. And my guest this evening is Dr. Philip Weir, naval historian, first century of the 20th century, been on TV. Who do you think you are? And the author of the newly published Dunkirk Little Ships book. So good evening, Phil. How are you?
Good evening. I'm pretty good. Thank you very much.
Good. Well, we'll crack on. So it's oft discussed subject, Dunkirk, the little ships. How did you set about, and why did you set about doing a book about the little ships of Dunkirk? We'll start with that.
Well, it's a fun little story. I mean, I would love, I suppose, to have a grand sort of narrative around, grandparent was there or whatever, but it was one I was actually asked to do by Shire Publisher. It was originally a proposal by a chap called Nigel Sharp, to whom I am eternally grateful for sort of allowing me to do this. But he put the proposal in initially and found himself with an unfortunate contractual clash, and and the publishers were looking around for someone else to do it, and strangely enough, I'd been very recently at that point stood on the back of a boat with Marvin Humes of JLS fame, talking about Dunkirk, and my name apparently seemed to crop up. So my grand story behind it is that it came in off the back of spending time on the back of a boat with Marvin Humes. As these things go.
There's nothing wrong with that, and getting asked to do a book is always better than going around with a book that you've written that no one wants to publish. So it's the right way to do it, I guess, isn't it? Being asked to do it is, how many authors would like to be in that position? So brilliant. So your book is about the whole variety of vessels that were sent across the channel 80 years ago. Just give us, the viewers, an idea of the types of vessels, because we have the very, very small up to the very, very big. So what does it cover in terms of size and scale?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because I mean, as the title of the book itself suggests, Dunkirk is always associated with little ships, and I think everybody's sort of got their own little idea as to what constitutes the little ships. And in many respects, it's pretty much everything that goes over there. Because what you don't see going over to Dunkirk are the very, very big battleships. You don't see ocean liners of any great size going over there. It's largely the small ships of the warships, small ships of the fleet, the minesweepers, the destroyers. It's cross-channel ferries, all of them largely in the sort of 1,000, 2,000 ton range as the sort of top end of the ships that you see over there, right the way down, of course, through assorted trawlers, fishing boats, barges. You get some of the prototype British landing craft take part, arrive on the 29th, right the way down to, I think the smallest boat is a tiny little 14-foot little fishing smack that's now in the Imperial War Museum, the Tamsin. So it is quite a range, but it doesn't quite go all the way up as far as Dunkirk itself goes. Is kind of the interesting story with it. But yeah, it's the definition of what is a little ship is, of course, it's just an interesting one, and what people's perceptions are versus what actually turns up and does the lift.
And I think we'll touch on that as the interview goes on. But the public myth, or the popular myth, is partly based on what actually happened, but also this sort of self-generating movie image as well. And I'd like to tackle that as well as we go on. But the other thing I think is this idea that it was a hastily put together kind of running around at the last minute. getting it, and it wasn't quite that way, was it? I mean, it became clear quite early in May that the British Expeditionary Force would need to be pulled out of France, and at that stage a plan begins. So just run through the kind of various stages of how the naval operation was put together, and particularly things that you think we should know that counter what we think we know already, if you know what I mean. You know, that the myth busting.
Yeah, it's, in many respects, it was put together at extremely short notice. I mean, when you bear in mind, you go the other way, for example, for D-Day and so forth, you get sort of 6 months worth of very, very intricate planning that goes into an amphibious operation of that form. And in many respects, what you're looking at is an amphibious operation in reverse, but the planning time is wildly compressed. You don't, obviously there's no 6 months. There is no plan, sat somewhere in December-ish 1939 to rapidly evacuate the British Expeditionary Force off the beaches, and no sign of one being created. But yeah, it does all start a lot earlier than most of us sort of seem to think. I mean, it becomes fairly obvious to, and Lord Gort, who is an interesting military commander, and I think gets a certain amount of criticism, not entirely unreasonably, I think, for a lot of aspects of his command. But in this crucial point, I think calls it right, and B, very bravely calls it very early, in terms of, it was around about the 18th where he's sort of sat there realizing that basically there is a serious danger of the British Expeditionary Force and of course the northern French armies of being completely cut off and sealed off with their backs to the sea. And it's really sort of after that, the day after that, in fact, he sends back to the War Office saying, realistically, we need to start planning on pulling back on the French, northern French coast, and potentially getting the hell out of here. And there was a meeting in the War Office on the 19th where they basically sort of sit down and discuss this and realize that, yeah, this is probably what we need to do. And they hand command to Vice Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, who is at the time flag officer commanding Dover, a retired officer brought back in to command what is anticipated to be one of the more active naval sectors. The risk of a brief digression, in essence, it's a replication of what they anticipate from the First World War, where the choke point that is the Dover Straits is going to be one of the key points in the Battle of the Atlantic, as fought. It's going to be the barrier through which you need to kill U-boats. So that's given to Ramsay. It's taken out of what is the Nor Command, the bigger command at Chatham. And Ramsay is basically placed directly under the Admiralty. That's his authority line. He reports direct back to First Sea Lord. And obviously his sector is that one that deals with those northern French ports at this point. You go much further east and yeah, it drops into to Admiral Drax's Nor Command, but this particular sector is Ramsay's, and he is given the job of organizing any evacuation that takes place. And in fact, evacuation starts the day after this, on the 20th, because of course they realize that the trap is almost closed, and they start to bring out what are known as the useless mouths, as the term used, but effectively rear echelon supply troops and all this sort of stuff. And it's not just the Brits leaving at this point; it's also the French. Amiral Nord, Admiral Admiral, who's based at Dunkirk, who's basically Ramsay's direct opposite number, French Navy. authorizes exits of the French rear echelon troops as well. And I mean, they start effectively shunting them out, predominantly across to Cherbourg, to start reforming the army outside the trap. And there's a fascinating story attached, because in the initial wave that leaves is the remnants of the Dutch army aboard a steamer called the Pavon, and they unfortunately run into an airstrike that ends up, I think, severely damaging a tanker that's on its way out, demolishing a destroyer that the famous one that you see from the movie 2017 movie publicity shots of the three funnel destroyer with its bow completely wrecked. That's it. No, this is where this comes from. It she's escorting the Pavon and so forth out of Dunkirk on the 20th, before we really think of the evacuation having started. And Pavon also gets hit, gets grounded further up the coast by Calais, and the Dutch abandon her there and are unfortunately captured there. And that's sort of the end of the core of what was supposed to be a revivified Dutch legion that was supposed to be being reformed at Cherbourg. So it does start a lot earlier, and they start planning a good week or so in advance. Now, this continues going, and I think they get several tens of thousands. I think it's a good 30,000 British troops, give or take, come out in those sort of 6 days. That's before they actually order the evacuation itself on the evening of the 26th, which is just after. Just to again digress slightly, they understand in the midst of planning that the key to all of this is going to be ports. The physics of it are quite simple. In order to get large numbers of guys out of off of a coast rapidly, you need a port. No ifs, no buts. It's just very easy to pop a larger ship alongside a large lump of concrete and have them walk directly on. Getting guys off of a beach, particularly a very shallow sloping beach that you get in the Dunkirk area, is going to take time. And you're basically going to have to ferry them to the larger ship on that ship's small lifeboats, basically, and whatever else you've got around that's a very shallow draft. So it's going to be a tough job to do very quickly. And at that point, you're going to have ships stationary off the beach, basically in the face of fairly serious air power. This is not healthy. It's a lot easier, a lot quicker to do it in ports. And at the time the pocket gets cut off, you've got 3 ports really, at Boulogne, Dunkirk, and Calais. Realistically, Ostend is still available at this point and will be until about the 28th, when the Belgians surrender. But that ends up being a non-realistic solution in terms of getting people there. So it's basically these 3 ports, and through this you need to either deliver reinforcements, ammunition, food, or alternatively get people out. And that's the key to all of this. And of course, unfortunately, by the time you get to the 26th, morning of the 26th, you've lost Calais and Boulogne, and the army is basically down to just Dunkirk in terms of of ports to get out of. So this is hugely important in terms of the planning, and they do try and send in a couple of brigades to hold Calais and Boulogne. Famously, you end up with one of those brigades being sacrificed in the name of Allied amity. It does end up being whittled down to Dunkirk itself, and the plans are in place to start getting stuff out of the ports, and they've started assembling ships. You've got throughout, really, to be honest, throughout the May after the invasion goes ahead, from May the 10th, you start getting more and more reinforcements of warships, cruisers and destroyers and smaller, down to Chatham, down to Portsmouth, down to Dover itself. So there's already an assembly of ships there when the order goes ahead. You've also got in place I think there's give or take about 30 or so troop ships, the cross-channel ferries and Manx packets and so forth. And these, bear in mind, these are the same ships essentially that delivered the BEF across. By and large, you see a lot of crossover with it's the same ships that have been delivering troops there since the first days of the war. And you've got this assembly of maritime lift there. And when the order goes, things are already in place and things are already starting to move.
But the key thing, of course, is it may be the same ships, but the time frame, the deadline is much tighter getting them out than it had been to take them across when you've got kind of phony world. So same ships. And you mentioned Ramsey earlier, and I want to also ask if there's other people we should know about beyond Ramsey. But I mean, clearly you can't study something like Dunkirk or indeed D-Day in my case and not come away with a huge amount of respect for Ramsey. But what were his particular skills? What do you think he brought that was maybe unique to him, or what? Because they, as you said, they haven't really been planning for an extraction operation. It's not what the Navy have spent generations doing. So he clearly picked up the order and went with it. But what were his skills? What do you think he brought?
He was a classic organizer, as much as anything else. I mean, he'd spent a very significant chunk of his career very successfully operating as chief of staff to various people. Although slightly less successfully in his final role as chief of staff to Commander-in-Chief Home Fleet at that point, Admiral Sir Roger Backhouse. They fell out rather unfortunately because Backhouse largely insisted on doing everything himself, and didn't delegate particularly well. Although there is a touch of an exaggeration there, having done a bit of digging into Backhouse's background. But he was basically spent a lot of his career as a flag officer as chief of staff, which basically involved doing the paperwork, doing the organizing fleets, getting things together. And this was a real skill set of his, along with getting along with all sorts of other people from even other services. I mean, he was one of the few people who could seriously tease Montgomery and get away with it. He really, despite the fallout with Backhouse and his unfortunate, because he's actually a retired officer, just to explain, he was. He and Backhouse fell out in 35, 36, I think it was. And after that, he sort of stepped away and resigned his post as Backhouse's chief of staff, or was relieved. And it was never really given employment thereafter, dropped onto half pay and dropped onto the retirement list for a few years until he was recalled as flag officer Dover in 39. So he did have this particular falling out, but he was actually genuinely very good at inter-service relations and getting on with other admirals and other general officers and so forth. So he was basically an extremely capable organizer and very, very good at sort of alliance politics and getting teams together and working with them.
So you mentioned to be able to delegate there, which I think is key as well. And give a couple of people that we perhaps haven't heard of who he delegated to, because we have this idea that Ramsay is working there 24 hours a day, doing everything himself, micromanaging everything, which can't have been the case. So there must have been a couple of really good understudies there that we have lost to the mists of time that we could perhaps give a name check to.
Absolutely. There's. There is an interesting point with this in that Dover Command was not a major command point at this stage. It's got to be said. The Navy had created, in fact, the Navy and the Air Force had created a number of joint headquarters in the years before the war, literally sort of 38, 39. Major headquarters sat under Chatham, Portsmouth, Plymouth, Rosyth. They were also building another one under Liverpool that is now famous as the Western Approaches headquarters. It's these sort of big joint bunkers with effectively a coastal command group plus the local naval C&C in them. Dover Castle, which is Ramsay's headquarters, isn't one of them. So he's got less facilities, he's got less staff, but because he's under the Admiralty do reinforce him and particularly send him as reinforcement Vice Admiral Sir James Somerville, another retiree, this time on health grounds, who steps in as his deputy. I mean, he's the guy who unfortunately delivers hand delivers the news to I think the Calais garrison that they are to fight on to the last, but he effectively steps in so Ramsay can get sleep effectively, and they are both the same rank, and it works very seamlessly. Somerville again is one of the Navy's great personalities. He's far better known for his fighting at sea in terms of his time with Force H, the Bismarck, and also in the Far East with the Eastern Fleet and so forth. But he again successfully steps in and is capable of working with others and charming others, and keeps the organization going, and doesn't have an ego that wants to take over Ramsay's lead effectively. So he basically follows Ramsay's organization and keeps it rolling while allowing Ramsay to get some sleep over that sort of 9 days. So Somerville is absolutely key, but I mean there are, of course, as you rightly say, others in the background. His chief of staff, Captain Michael Denny, is the. It's worth saying that in order to run an evacuation, as we mentioned, it's all about the numbers. It's the maths. It's getting ships alongside, getting them filled up. Literally, it's almost like running a train service. Only when you're being bombed, scarily enough. But the more efficient you can get things rolling in alongside, load, away, back to Dover, Harwich, wherever, unload, off to refuel, rearm, back down, and reload again, as literally almost as a sort of circuit rail service. To a timetable almost, then the more efficient your lift is going to be. And the brains behind that is Captain Michael Denny, who goes on to be a very successful aircraft carrier captain later on in the war. So, I mean, he's another sort of key brain behind it all. Further back in the background, I mean, we sort of alluded to some of the small civilian ships, and of course they're the ones that everybody knows. But there's an interesting gentleman, the commander of the small boats pool, Vice Admiral Lionel Preston, yet again, interestingly, another retiree who was brought back in initially to deal with minesweeping. But he gets put in charge of the small boats pool, and by remarkable coincidence, of course, famously, he's the guy who, on the 14th of May, so far before everybody knows that they're cut off, and this is basically give or take around the time that the defences of Sedan are being breached. Preston and the Ministry of Shipping are sort of broadcasting through the BBC, asking for people with boats bigger than 30 foot to register them. And of course, by the time you get to the 26th, and they realise that they need boats to shallow draft boats to get people off the beach, well, they've got themselves a list of boats to go and choose from. So Preston is the guy that organises an awful lot of that, and he's the sort of brains behind a lot of that, and had the luck / foresight / whatever you want to call it to put out that call on the 14th. So
just interrupting you there because I am, and that call, I'm surprised. I'm not surprised because I have read it, but it is quite. What was the reason for having the ships registered? Because at that stage, it clearly wasn't to send them over to desperately rescue people off the sand of France. Just for those who are watching, what was the reason?
It's basically as an assistance to the Navy in terms of stuff like securing ports. You basically need an awful lot of small boats to do little security patrols around harbours, and to ferry men in and out to ships at anchor in outer harbours, and little supply drops, supply runs, all this sort of stuff. So that's basically what they're after: little little ships to go round and sort of keep an eye on things and move small numbers of people. Jack going on leave and all this sort of stuff. And it's for that sort of thing. In essence, it's remarkably enough, an incredible coincidence. But yeah, they then suddenly realise that this is going to be incredibly usul for an evacuation.
Yeah.
But
I mean, and as you said, fortuitous that someone had bothered to compile that list. But what's intriguing me already is that this, you're talking about it being operated like a railway line. It's all about numbers, and it's which I completely get. But we're already, in a sense, deviating away from the popular myth of it being this kind of hastily put together thing. That, and I'm intrigued because I said in my tweets to you earlier, that's something that really does interest me. And I talked to Alan Allport last week about in his Britain at Bay book about how he refers to the Mark Rylance character in Christopher Nolan's film as being the representation of the plucky Englander and going off and not quite knowing where he's going and not quite knowing what he's doing. And I want to, I know it's going to be annoying for you as a proper historian to kind of bring it back to that public myth, but I think that is what a lot of people who are watching will have, this idea that it's just, people going and with their boat, not knowing where they're going, not knowing. And I find that intriguing. And I also want to discuss, I'll hand it over to you in a minute, about this enduring myth of the little ships, and even the title of your book, you didn't call it, the large destroyers that were helped out by, you use that title. So it's, whether we like it or not, it is part of the story, isn't it? So, the little ships. I mean, how many were? I mean, we know the data. Well, some people know that the great majority of people were rescued by troop ships and by destroyers and by the larger ships, but a percentage was rescued by the little ships. So bring in their actual story and exactly the first day they went across and who was actually kind of in charge of that aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, the little ships aspect is fascinating. It's actually something I've had a brief chat with Alan over a wee while ago, and yeah, it's fascinating. I do quite like the Mr. Dawson character in the film, and he's actually very specifically modelled on a particular individual that some people may know, some people may not. An astonishing character by the name of Charles Leitola, who was the senior surviving officer of the Titanic, believe it or not, who went on to live a quite remarkable life in terms of becoming obviously as a naval reservist. So 2 years later, he's called up into the Navy in the First World War. Gets his ship, another liner, actually runs aground, I think, in Orkney. and is lost. So she'd been converted into an armed merchant cruiser at that point. But yeah, he's at the center of another liner loss. Then finds himself aboard another converted liner, but this time the seaplane carrier Campania, whereupon he's a navigating officer, gets a bit bored there, so starts learning to be an aerial navigator with the seaplane pilots, and is in essence one of the pioneers of the observer branch of the Fleet Air Arm, and teaching over water navigation. Ends up in destroyers, gets sunk in one, sinks another U-boat in rather controversial circumstances. Had an incredible life. So he's not an average kind of boatman. John Q, boat owner from the southwest or wherever. I forget where Mark Rylance's character was supposed to be from.
Was it Weymouth? I can't remember now. Yeah,
something like yeah.
Falmouth was it? I don't know.
I can't.
Somewhere west, isn't it? Anyway,
yeah. So yeah, he's not the actual individual. Is not the same sort of character as Rylance portrays. Although there are obviously significant elements of the story. He goes over there with his son and a sea scout by the name of Gerald, who doesn't incidentally fall down a hatch and die. He survived quite happily. But the son was rather older and actually in the Navy at the time. Although the bit with the deceased son in the RAF is actually very true to Leitola. Leitola's youngest son was one of those lost in that first day of the war raid against the German fleet in Wilhelmshaven, I think it was. So yeah, that bit is actually also was modelled on him. But yeah, fascinating character, and much like an awful lot of the rest of it, not really quite what we see, what is in reality. Because obviously he was still a naval reservist, a naval commander, and if you see him on the register of boats, it's Commander Charles Leitola as skipper of his own boat. Now, to sort of broaden that out to the big story, yeah, we've sort of mentioned Preston and his register, and I mean, what happens is pretty much immediately when he's given the job on the sort of 19th, 20th, Ramsay and his staff realise that because all things being equal, they're going to have to start pulling people off of beaches one way or the other, or at least be prepared for it. So the call goes out for anything with a shallow draft. They start out with Dutch barges that have evacuated across the channel when the Netherlands fell, and they start scouring their way through pretty much anything that floats in the shipyards around the south of England, including. I mean, they literally take Ramsay's barge over. His personal admiral's barge goes over. Similarly, the lifeboats from the home fleet flagship HMS Nelson are taken over. Ramsay's barge doesn't make it back, incidentally. I wouldn't like to have been the young officer who had to explain that one to the boss. So I mean, that's the initial series of vessels that starts to go across. But of course, there's Preston's list, and that's invoked very early. They do start trawling down the Thames for this, for anything that looks suitable, and they start, and it's Ministry of Transport, Ministry of Shipping, I think it is, and the Admiralty. They basically send guys from the Chatham barracks down to go and pick this stuff up. And permission is not asked; it's requisition. They just grab the stuff and start towing it down for the most part. So even the sort of 1958 film where you get the guys sort of handing over stuff and being signing stuff off at Tufts Boatyard, that does go on to an extent as the system progresses, but a lot of the early stuff, it's literally just lift and shift and it's towed. And I mean, there's a famous story that one chap spotted his boat disappearing off up the Thames and chases it as far as Teddington, only to discover when he gets as far as Teddington Lock that there are some people with uniforms and guns taking it away, and no, they're not stealing it, it's a requisition, sir, and it's all legal. Bye. So yeah, that's how a lot of that starts. And yeah, as things progress, you do start to get people, taking their own boats out as far as Chatham, and Tufts Boatyard is a noted assembly point earlier on down the river. But when they get to Chatham, for the most part, they are handed over to naval crews. It's Chatham Barracks, the Nor Command, Admiral Drax's guys that are providing most of the manpower for this. They are, as far as being not knowing where they're going, they are given charts of varying quality, because they're basically trying to grab every single chart they possibly can, and all this sort of stuff, and trying to get people and boats over there as fast as possible. But they are largely given charts, and they are following those that really do have a chart and get themselves across. And a lot of them, as I say, are actually being towed. So a goodly number of the boats just don't have people on at all. It's sent across on tugs and so forth, or rather behind tugs. So yeah, there's a degree of mythology to it. As I mentioned with Leitola, it's not unheard of for people to crew their own boats and take them over, but it was distinctly rare. I mean, Leitola was a particular exception anyway, because of his naval reserve rank, and his vast experience, and the fact that he was, he genuinely knew what he was doing, and they knew that. So yeah, the whole sort of chaps, and from both the 2017 film and 58, and indeed the 1942 Mrs. Miniver, which is kind of, in many respects, the
we forget that one in the genre, don't we? Yeah, it also counts, didn't it? Yeah.
And that's the titular heroine's husband takes his boat across and comes back with it, shot up and so forth. And you get this marvelous scene with the stirring music of the sort of growing wave of boats going down the Thames in that one as well. And yeah, it's one of those marvelous sort of exaggerations that, because it's got a notable element of truth to it, it really grips the imagination. Similarly, you get the words of the likes of J.B. Priestley in his broadcast just afterwards, talking about the glorious little steamers who made their journey to hell and returned glorious. Bear in mind, incidentally, that a lot of the sort of paddle steamers he's referring to had actually already been requisitioned at the start of the war and were minesweepers. But there's this, because they were so synonymous with the sort of English summer holiday kind of thing, it all adds to this certain kind of national identity, if you will.
There's a bit of romanticism as well, isn't there? Just a bit of that. And as a historian, so you're looking at the actual history and who were on the boats and what were the boats and where did they come from and all this, and the ships and the vessels and that, and yet babbling along is the fact, Mrs. Miniver, Dunkirk, both versions, and the images and the paintings. I mean, I do my prep for the show, and you search and stuff, and there's numerous sort of art prints you can buy of heroic guys in woolly pullers with pipes sitting on a front of like 10-foot long rowing boats going across. You think, I don't know where this all came from, but how difficult is it to balance, presenting real history with these ideas that are partly based on legend and also partly based on this necessary image that Churchill and others had to present the public, that we're not defeated, we've got this spirit, we are all together. That was very important. So how do you balance those two two areas when you're doing your research?
It's interesting. I mean, in many respects, my suspicion is that if you sort of charge headlong at these things and shout at people saying this is wrong, you're all a bunch of complete idiots, you're not going to get terribly far. It's butting your head up against a brick wall. So, I mean, realistically, for my money, I certainly within the book, I do try and look at Dunkirk and how it is remembered and why it is remembered that way. And I mean, it's worth bearing in mind, of course, at the end of all of this, the small civilian ships are a key element of the material surviving from the evacuation. Most of the bigger stuff's now gone. The destroyers were subject to obviously war wear and tear and obsolescence, and similarly a lot of the passenger ships. So the little ships and the association of Dunkirk little ships, which formed around the 25th anniversary, they are a hugely important part of how we remember it, because they are what's left in many respects. And if you can't sit there and batter your head against it and say, oh, didn't happen, didn't exist, or anything ridiculous like that. Because quite apart from anything else, is you would be taking it far too far in any case. Obviously these boats did take part; they did go there. And in some cases, some of them were crewed by their owners. I mean, it's interesting. I neglected to mention that. I mean, a lot of those that do sort of man their own vessels, tend to be fishing crews who tend to be somewhat forgotten amongst the sort of the film image. But yeah, a lot of the fishing crews have a tendency to crew their own. So yeah, I think you've got to engage with how people look at it and think about it, and how they've seen it on film, and look at why why things are remembered that way, and why people still think of it that way. And there's, in many respects, there's good reasons for it. I mean, I say there is this great grain of truth to it. I mean, it's a little like the whole dam busters bit with old Barnes Wallis, and you watch the film and you barely get an idea that he's one of the chief designers in one of the world's biggest arms manufacturers.
Yeah, it all happened in a bathtub, didn't it? Pretty much.
Exactly.
Yeah. You talked about the Dunkirk, the legacy, and the little ships and what have you. So what does it mean to you? You're born like I am, several generations after war. What do you think in 2020, 80 years on, the Dunkirk means? What is it? Is it purely the acknowledgement of a military operation that was carried out with great success, or is there something more romantic that is as important, or maybe even more important? What's your personal take as Phil the guy, as opposed to Dr. Philip Weir the historian?
That's another interesting one. It's inevitably there is a sort of psychological hold on it with the Second World War. It is surprisingly, despite the whole sort of Cold War, fall of the Berlin Wall, September the 11th, and so forth, the Second World War is still, to a large degree, still the defining cataclysm of the last century. It's not been surpassed, and God forbid it won't be for some considerable time, or indeed hopefully ever. So it's got that psychological hold on us generally anyway, I think, and it is still a significant part of the way the world is these days. And you're quite right. It's one of those. It's the last real time that we came out with some, really quite remarkable stories, and that do have this romantic air to them. you do, I think, struggle to find too many sort of after the Second World War. You might get the Berlin airlift or a couple of others like that that have similar connotations. But yeah, it's there is the air of romance attached to it, attached to the psychological hold of it being still a formative element of our world at the moment. And of course, it is a great operation. It's at its absolute heart, it's a great story. The whole perception of it's, you can sum it up in a single word: Dunkirk. It's that sort of single geographical area. You can pin it down there. Short space of time, 9 days. Fairly defined protagonists in terms of the British forces against the Germans. Admittedly, you do start running the risk of writing out the other allies and so forth, and other aspects of the story. But you can see why it's told that way, because it just fits nicely. It's got all these little hooks, the sort of civilian involvement and all this sort of thing that really kind of catch the imagination. And there is, the perception of great peril and all this sort of thing. It's got a whole host of ingredients that really just make it one of the great stories of the...
And clearly people like Churchill and J.B. Priestley and the makers of Mrs. Miniver and that recognized that at the time. It wasn't something that we only recognized decades on. It was recognized at the time that it represented something more beyond just a successful operation, and that's only to the good. I mean, that's how we all remember it. So there's some takeaways when you did your book. Are there any other couple of little myths that we should debunk about the little ships, particularly, not to spoil people, but little kind of tasters of things we go, actually that's not true? What riles you when you watch a movie or you go, yeah, that didn't happen? There must, what are the things?
I've got to be honest. I as an aside, I try not to get too riled by movies these days. As a young master's student, I found myself watching a certain film by a certain Australian chap, who I won't name, and while I was writing on the American War of Independence. I'll leave you to guess the movie.
Oh right, yeah, got it. Yeah.
Yes, you're with me now. At which point, I'm sort of sat there feeling the blood pressure kind of spurting out of my ears, and wondering what my TV would look like on the floor of outside the window. And I realized that I probably ought to calm down, because it wasn't my TV, and B, if I kept watching films like this, it was going to get very expensive very quickly. So I do try to sort of dial the brain back and relax before watching these things. But yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of little bits and pieces. I mean, one of the key ones is always that Dunkirk is kind of the end of the story. People kind of forget that there is a whole other evacuation from the continent that goes on a few weeks down the line in Operation Ariel.
Just up the road from me, in fact. Cherbourg. I when I did some research for my writing and stuff, the scale of the Cherbourg operations and had kind of passed me by a little bit. I knew they happened, but hang on, they're really, really quite big. And and the fact it didn't end at Dunkirk is very important to get across.
Yeah, and I mean, it's again a hugely successful evacuation by and large. I mean, they get nearly 200,000 out. Although, of course, there is the famous loss of the Lancastria, the Britain's greatest maritime disaster, occurs in the midst of that. So I mean, that's one of the great keys. I think people often tend to forget or neglect the fact that there is, under Ramsay's command, there is a French Pas de Calais flotilla under a Rear Admiral Marcel Landrieu, which puts, I think they put a good 200 vessels. There's about 15 something destroyers, and another sort of 180 odd fishing vessels and assorted others that they put into it. They're basically sat there operating and largely evacuating French troops at the same time, but there is a significant French operation going on there as well, effectively to a degree coordinated by Ramsay, with Landrieu in harness. So a lot of the French side, I think, can get a bit neglected on this side of the pond, and of course, famously, the French defenders of Dunkirk itself are. I mean, those, of course, they turn up in the film, and particularly briefly in the 2017 film. They do turn up, and of course they 40,000 or so are left behind. And I mean, that's another interesting point that I think people kind of neglect, is that the British evacuation finishes a day before the whole evacuation itself. You get an extra day for the French. Ramsay sends his forces in. It's really about the last day they can, and you've got crews dropping wholesale through exhaustion at this point. People and machinery stretch beyond breaking point. But they go back for one last shot and get, I think it's good 25, 30,000 out, but have to leave behind another 40,000 French, because the defenses just aren't going to last much longer at that point. And bits and pieces around. I mentioned the fact that the evacuation kind of begins rather earlier than we think, and it relies on a lot of because this is one thing that the British do put into the alliance, an awful lot of sea lift. There is a goodly chunk of latent sea lift capacity there that Ramsay can call on in order to organize this evacuation. It's not going to happen if Ramsay doesn't have his 15 or 20 destroyers and 30 or so troop ships there. You need that there sat waiting kind of thing for this to really happen over the span of time that it does. So again, the sort of the organization bit and having the capacity pre-existing to do it is absolutely crucial.
I think generally with any study of World War II, you end up with all of the major battles end up being, of course, a team effort, but a certain player on the team or ends up getting more fame. You get Arnhem, the defenders of the bridge, you get D-Day, Rangers and Commandos over. It's always the case. There's nothing going to stop that. That's always going to, the history, the public are always going to hone in on one aspect of it more than others. And that's just how it's going to be, whether we like it or not. That's how it's going to be. So,
absolutely. I mean, there's just to chuck in the other one. I mean, it always kind of mildly entertains me that 1940, you've got these two seminal events really in Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain, and basically the Navy sort of comes out as the great heroes, I guess, of of Dunkirk, and the RAF comes out the great heroes of the Battle of Britain, and both services kind of chuck the odd brick at the other for being absent during the other operation, which is not true in either case.
No, absolutely, yeah. They're both jointly involved in both operations, and the negativity that surrounds each. You're right. That's a very good point, a very pertinent point. So, I mean, I think you're right when I had the same discussion with Alan Allport last week. Is that if you have lots of new ideas about something, if you ram them down people's throat, they just will repel and react against you. You've got to kind of tease them in with some, here's what you think, but also here's a little bit of side detail there, and that's the way to do it, I think. So, in terms of what's next for you, what would be the next project? Supposing another publisher or the same publisher comes and says, what would be your dream project in terms of the Royal Navy? What would you like to, or not necessarily the Royal Navy, but the naval aspect of World War II? What would be your dream writing project?
I mean, there's a couple floating around out there. I mean, I would kind of like to delve into, for example, the wartime career of the Commander-in-Chief Home Fleet who sank the Bismarck, Admiral Sir John Tovey, who he's one of he doesn't have a biography that I'm aware of. I don't think anybody's his papers are sat in National Maritime Museum, but nobody's ever really sort of dug that deeply into him, and certainly not done a biography of him. I think he'd be an interesting character to play with, not least because I know Andrew Gordon's fabled, still awaited biography of Ramsay is lying out there. Not quite out yet, I believe, still delayed. But yeah, that's that'll be certainly one to look forward to. But I mean, there are assorted bits and pieces that I'd love to play with, and the Norway and the loss of HMS Glorious is one that's fascinated me for some considerable time, and the Northern campaign as a whole. I mean, we didn't really mention this, but of course Norway.
Of course, yeah.
The evacuation of Norway begins. The first ships start steaming into Norway to evacuate the troops there. Pretty much simultaneously with HMS Shikari, the last destroyer leaving Dunkirk. It's literally the same morning. You get the two shifting out of there. So, and the whole Norway campaign it's a very naval campaign. It goes on for a lot longer than that, or very naval and air, because you get assorted fleet air arm airstrikes, you get carrier airstrikes on shipping. Actually, throughout the Battle of Britain, this is see my Twitter feed and a couple of other bits.
In general, because you get the fledgling commandos starting. There's lots of firsts involved in that make a very good show, I think. But it's interesting that we seem to be as the public, we seem to be able to contend with one event happening at the same time. We can't. We have to deal with them one at a time. So it's Dunkirk, then it's Battle of Britain. And we don't like accepting that there are multiple things happening at the same time. We seem to have this one after the other approach to war, stacking, which of course is ridiculous. So there's always things going on. And it's why I think the Battle of Atlantic gets so overlooked. It's so long and so continuous that we don't, the major peaks of the Battle of Atlantic seem to end up coinciding with when other things are happening that are taking precedent. It just kind of gets forgotten. And I always maintain the Battle of Atlantic is the most important campaign of World War II, and yet most people wouldn't. Well, most historians I think would agree that, but the general public maybe not. But anyway,
I mean, and Dunkirk is, or rather, the fall of France specifically is, of course, one of the great turning points in that as well. Because I mentioned earlier the whole situation with Dunkirk as the key choke point where they're supposed to stop the U-boats. But of course, France falls, and literally a few days later, I think it's July the 5th, I think, give or take, the first U-boats are starting to arrive at Lorient. They've bypassed the great choke point of the Straits of Dover. They're right out into the Atlantic, and this is the key point really that starts the big happy time.
Yeah. Well, I think we've done an hour, which I'm surprised at, and I'm trying to keep my shows under an hour because it's with the viewer figures apparently. So well, it's been brilliant. I've enjoyed it. So people can obviously buy your book in the usual places right now. I'll put the image up again, but it's just the Kindle is not available yet according to Amazon, but the book is out now to buy, isn't it? So
it is, yes. Yeah, it's out to buy. Waterstones, WH Smith's, Amazon. Choose your dealer, kind of thing. But yes, feel free to buy it and peruse, and hopefully it'll.
Sorry, I was just saying. I haven't read it yet. I confess I haven't read it. It's on order. It hasn't actually come yet. It's, but I know your subject, so it's. I've got lots of books on their way over to France. Doing the opposite journey from the Dunkirk. They're coming to France, not. But anyway, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Phil. So we'll have you on again because I think we've all learned something, and the little ships is something that is always going to be part of the British psyche. It seems to be Mag, my other half, she was said, is little ship something that means something to British people? I said, yes, absolutely. And being French, it was interesting that she knows about Operation Dynamo. We've been there, but the little ships idea doesn't mean the same thing to the French people. It's obviously a very purely British and maybe even a purely English thing. But
I think probably so, yes.
That's how these things end up. Anyway, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Phil. For those watching again, the viewers, nothing for a couple of days. Friday's the big one. We've got our Spike Milligan show with various guests, including Spike's daughter Jane, Peter Caddick Adams, my mate Colin Taylor, and fingers crossed Stuart Lee, the comedian, will be on that one to talk about Spike Milligan. I'm really looking forward to that one. So that will be 8 p.m. French time, 7 p.m. UK time, Friday evening. Working on a first Stalingrad show or Volgograd show coming up in November. Obviously, lockdown here, lockdown in the UK will prevent us doing live streams, and we'll continue to bring you interviews and panel discussions. So don't forget to check out our Patreon page and consider banging a few coins our way each month to help us bring you these things, and pay a tour guide who's got no work, because I haven't got a book out. Anyway, thank you very much, Phil. It's been a pleasure talking to you. We'll have you on again. And buy Phil's book, everybody. And this is Paul Woodadge, World War II TV, saying we'll see you on Friday. Thank you very much for watching. Good night.